Good morning. This is Ron. It is Saturday, June the 2nd. Welcome to Story Time. And thank you, thank you, thank you. That's right. This is Ron. I am the only true conservative in the United States of America because I'm the only person that makes the presumption for the status quo. So, one of the things that I wanted to address is the importance. Ayn Rand had, let me do a little aside or explanation. Ayn Rand had written in one of her books that if you're going to defeat the left, the way to do it is by pulling out their arguments by their psycho-epistemological roots. And the point that she was getting there is that you have to dig down deep and get to the base of their argument and defeat the base of their argument. Once you've done that, then they're through. If you don't do that, then they will continue on. They are going to be unpersuaded. They are going to just continue on with the same kinds of arguments that they're using currently. For example, you have a situation now with the left where they use various isms, determinism and skepticism and materialism, to name but three. Determinism is the one that is always at play when you see a situation where the government is supposed to be coming to the rescue of the students, or the regular citizens, the rank and file, the general public, let's put it that way. So in a case for smoking, for instance, so it's the government's job to discourage people from smoking and to help them quit, those that do, and to curb the tobacco companies' urge to allegedly encourage people to smoke. So that is determinism, because the theory behind it is that in terms of all government involvement is that people have no free will. And I've heard the left make the argument, who in their right mind would use a product that, when used as directed, results in disease and death. Okay, so what they're doing right there is setting it up. They're saying that, setting up the deterministic argument by saying that we have no free will, that nobody that had an ounce of free will would start smoking in the first place. Okay, and anybody with free will would quit, but that they have no free will, that we are forced to smoke. Those people that smoke because of forces beyond our control. In this case, the tobacco companies that lure us in with free samples. They used to do that, have free samples that they give out, that have people that would actually stand out on sidewalks in busy intersections or cities and hand out free samples of cigarettes. I haven't seen that much lately, but also with commercials. So they brainwash people and do various things to encourage people to smoke, and they do it all in the name of profits. This is crap. The fact of the matter is that all businesses, if they want to stay in business, have to find out what it is people want. It's not create a need, then fill it. It is find a need, then fill it. So the left's representation of business is create a need and then fill it. But the real way business is done is find a need, then fill it, because it's just impossible to create a need. So in this particular case, theoretically, then they have created the need for tobacco and creating tobacco culture. And that all of creating this tobacco culture forces people to smoke. And so it is the government's job to intervene and provide counter force. Because anytime the government's getting involved, we're talking about using force. We're talking about using taxpayer money. In some cases, we're talking about using a disincentive of maybe jail time or civil suits in order to discourage big businesses. But that's why the government's always supposedly on the side of the little guy. Same thing with the cars, with automobiles. The left alleges that there's a car culture, and that this car culture was created by the automobile industry and the oil industry, and that they conspired together to force people to buy and drive cars. Again, there was another lefty that once said, who in their right mind would spend money on a product that, when used properly, just ends up getting burned up and shot out your exhaust pipe, i.e., gasoline? So, again, what they're trying to do is set up the determinism angle and suggest to people that the only reason that anybody actually drives, that nobody in their right mind would drive if they had a choice, that if they had free will, they would dump their cars in a hot minute. But they're forced to by this car culture. So the government needs to get involved. It needs to create, lately it's called road diets, where they're curbing, going from 2 lanes to 1 lane in certain places, and that is supposed to create. The whole idea is to create traffic jams so as to discourage people from driving their cars. Another method is to drive up gas prices via taxes and fees, so that again people are going to eventually get tired. It's going to defeat the car culture. Let's put it that way. So as to defeat the car culture and force people to do what they supposedly really want to do anyways, which is get out of their cars, which is BS. We have free will, and we know in both these situations we do, because if people were forced, everyone would be forced. Everyone would smoke. Even at the height of the smoking craze back in the 60s and 70s, only 40% of Americans smoked. That's a much larger number than it is today. I think it's closer to 20%. But 40% of those people at that time smoked. Not everybody, not by a long shot, not even half. And the same thing with car culture. There's plenty of people that take the bus, ride a bicycle, or use other means and modes of transportation other than the automobile. So this idea that everybody's forced to do it is just BS. But it's an argument you have to address. You have to address that. When you hear somebody making the argument, a politician particularly, that says, hey, the government needs to get involved to put a stop to something, is determinism. And the proper response to that politician is to say, excuse me, but determinism is dead. We all have free will. We're in our cars because we choose to be in our cars. We may choose to be in cars because we find it the most efficient form of transportation, because it's much more comfortable or more desirable than public transportation, or just because we like cars. But either way, it's because we choose to be in cars. We have free will, and determinism is dead. This is one of the things that frustrates me with John and Ken, who think they've got the answers for a lot of issues, and in reality they don't, because they don't look deep enough, and because they really don't have the education. They haven't taken a look at philosophy and have a true understanding of the foundation that philosophy provides. Because determinism and skepticism and materialism are all philosophical theories. They're really philosophical mistakes, but that's they're still theories, but they're wrong theories. So when you hear somebody that's trying to make a deterministic argument, that's the proper thing to do. If they're making a skeptical argument, all environmental issues are based on skepticism. Okay. And so when you hear people making environmental arguments, we need to cut CO2 levels to combat climate change. Sorry, skepticism is dead. The fact is, we can and do know things with certainty, and we know for a matter of fact that there is no such thing as climate change, or there is no global warming, or the best answer for that one is, we know for a matter of fact that CO2 is heavier than oxygen, and therefore not a greenhouse gas. But you have to get to that skepticism, determinism, materialism point where you're debunking that, and that's when you're going to put a stop to their arguments. Otherwise, like I said, you're just arguing past them, and they're just going to continue on using this technique in other ways, shapes, and forms. Okay, so when I come back, I'm going to be reading from an issue of Imprimis. Thank you. And today I'm reading from an old issue of Imprimis, September 2014, volume 43, number 9, and it's The History and Danger of Administrative Law by Philip Hamburger from the Columbia Law School. There are many complaints about administrative law, including that it is arbitrary, that it is a burden on the economy, and that it is an intrusion on freedom. The question I will address is whether administrative law is unlawful, and I will focus on constitutional history. Those who forget history, it is often said, are doomed to repeat it. And this is what has happened in the United States with the rise of administrative law, or, more accurately, administrative power. Administrative law is commonly defended as a new sort of power, a product of the 19th and 20th centuries that developed to deal with the problems of modern society in all its complexity. From this perspective, the framers of the Constitution could not have anticipated it, and the Constitution could not have barred it. What I will suggest in contrast is that administrative power is actually very old. It revives what used to be called prerogative or absolute power, and it is thus something that the Constitution centrally prohibited. But first, what exactly do I mean by administrative law or administrative power? Put simply, administrative acts are binding or constraining edicts that come not through law, but through other mechanisms or pathways. For example, when an executive agency issues a rule constraining Americans, barring an activity that results in pollution, for instance, on restricting how citizens can use their land, it is an attempt to exercise binding legislative power not through an act of Congress, but through an administrative edict. Similarly, when an executive agency adjudicates a violation of one of these edicts in order to impose a fine or some other penalty, it is an attempt to exercise binding judicial power not through a judicial act, but again through an administrative act. In a way, we can think of administrative law as a form of off-road driving. The Constitution offers two avenues of binding power: the acts of Congress and the acts of the courts. Administrative acts by executive agencies are a way of driving off-road, exercising power through other pathways. For those in the driver's seat, this can be quite exhilarating. For the rest of us, it's a little unnerving. The Constitution authorizes three types of power, as we all learned in school. The legislative power is located in Congress, executive power is located in the president and his subordinates, and the judicial power is located in the courts. How does administrative power fit into that arrangement? The conventional answer to this question is based on the claim of the modernity of administrative law. Administrative law, this argument usually goes, began in 1887 when Congress created the Interstate Commerce Commission, and it expanded decade by decade as Congress created much more agencies. A variant of this account suggests that administrative law is actually a little bit older, that it began to develop in the early practices of the federal government of the United States. But whether it began in the 1790s or in the 1880s, administrative law, according to this account, is a post-1789 development. And, this is the key point, it arose as a pragmatic and necessary response to new and complex practical problems in American life. The pragmatic and necessitous character of this development is almost a mantra. And of course, if looked at that way, opposition to administrative law is anti-modern and quixotic. Or chaotic. There we go. But there are problems with this conventional history of administrative law. Rather than being a modern post-constitutional American development, I argue that the rise of administrative law is essentially a reemergence of the absolute power practiced by pre-modern kings. Rather than a modern necessity, it is a latter-day version of a reoccurring threat, a threat inherent in human nature and in the temptations of power. Okay, so that's going to do it for this article for right now. The next part of this article is titled The Prerogative Power of Kings. And so I will cover that in a later episode. So when I come back, I've got something new, and I'm going to be reading from Sun Stories, Tales from Around the World to illuminate the days and nights of our lives. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And so I'm going to be reading the introduction to Sun Stories Tales from Around the World to Eliminate the Days and Nights of Our Lives by Carolyn McVicker Edwards, author of The Storyteller's Goddess. The Reverend Clement Moore wrote A Visit from St. Nicholas, commonly known as The Night Before Christmas, in the 19th century. So powerfully did that poem's cold and dark distill a wintertime mood that even 20th century Southern Californians ice their suburban houses with fake snow. As a little girl in Los Angeles on Christmas Eve, I would lie in my bed, hugging to myself a dream of bounty as I listened for the possible skidding of sleigh runners on the roof. Perhaps, if I just could stay awake, I might be able to hear Santa Claus stuff himself and his burden down our non existent chimney. I had no idea, of course, that my imagination had been caught by a winter hope as old as humankind. No seasonal holidays are more celebrated in the modern Eurocentric world than those that honor the Northern Hemisphere's return of the light. Even in Australia, whose actual winter solstice comes in June rather than December, people with European roots make great Christmas feasts in the heat of their summer. But today, because of electric lights, central heating, and supermarkets, we have only a dim memory of the time when the return of the light actually heralded the end of a season of deprivation and fear. Today, the winter stories we most often tell ourselves are about metaphorical suns only. A tiny season is born in the Christmas story. A tiny sun is born in the Christmas story. Lights in a temple stay miraculously lit in a Hanukkah story. La Befana, the Italian Santa Claus, searches for a special child to light the world. Read only in our science books about the centrality of the sun in our lives. Without the sun, they tell us, there would be no green plants, and thus no food, no fuel, no life. But crouched inside each of us is a shivering ancient, clothed in skins, huddled by a low fire. The ancient remembers. Sun and its yearly wax and wane is the mainstay of our lives. The majority of the stories in this book are old winter tales about the return not of a metaphorical sun, but of the real sun, which has faded for so long that our food stores are desperately low. At the winter solstice, we stand at a threshold. In Latin, solstice means sun stands still. At the summer solstice, sun stands at the threshold of its wane. But in winter, sun stands at the threshold of the wax of the light that promises spring. Psychologically, we stand at matching thresholds. We feel the inertia of our present position and teeter on the brink of change, which stirs us in hope and hopelessness, as well as fear, grief, surrender, and an energetic dignity otherwise known as problem solving. Over and over again in our lives, as in these stories, we are met at the threshold, not by saviors, but by tricksters, whose cleverness and bodily indulgences somersault us over our own edges. Culturally, the edge of a millennia rushes towards us. Our zeitgeist whispers that the planet is alive, that spirituality is based far more in the body and the earth than we've conceived in centuries, and that to sustain ourselves we must live more simply, more cooperatively, and bend our energy technologies to tap directly sun's power. Solstice, seasonally, psychologically, and culturally, is the time of the threshold. Sun itself pauses between decrease and increase. Beneath our celebratory efforts, we are often sad, lonely, afraid, and exhausted. Many of us are pioneering seasonal solstice celebrations that reframe our bodies and the earth as the houses of our spiritualities. On the threshold of great cultural change, we are greening our politics and our traditional understandings of religion. We are collecting multicultural myths, reorganizing our sense of gender, and revamping our metaphors for color and race. We are changing the ways we tap and use energy. We are building new cultural norms, exciting, inconvenient, and frustrating work. It is the nature of the isolation transition to swing us between hope and hopelessness. Stories are our transitional objects. Like blankets, smelling of comfort, they carry us through turbulence and chaos. They picture life the way it is, the way it can be, the way it will be. This book is a collection of stories from all over the world about the return of the sun and the light. They are stories of multiple deities, inspirited objects, lively darknesses, and tricksters. Sun in these stories is often personified: a young woman in a red dress, a red man in a chariot drawn by gold and silver horses. Sun is trapped in a tower, hiding in a cave, or packing his light in a great urn as a wedding gift. Sun is a magic sight giver shut in a box of dreams, the gift of the rooster, or the milk of a sky cow. Each story is introduced by remarks on its theme and culture of origin. They are tales to read, tell, paint, dance, dramatize. A play for classroom use of the Cherokee Mother Sun and Her People can be found in the appendix. Except for Seagull's Box, the retellings of these myths are in my own voice. I found numerous versions of some myths, such as the Polynesian Maui snares the sun. I found only one version for other stories, such as the Sukuman Harambe. Other stories, such as the Luyan rope from heaven, were stretched in 2 or 3 paragraphs in a reference book. Sketched. Still other stories, such as the Orissa tales from tribal India or the ancient Baltic tale of Saul, were summarized in just 2 or 3 sentences. The reader who reads the book straight through will find the stories strung like beads in a necklace, each offers its neighbors, offsets its neighbors. Others will fish for stories in the small summaries in the table of contents, and still others will be intrigued with the possibilities for comparing stories offered by the story and motif index at the back of the book. The stories may surprise adults. We are steeped, after all, in the mythology of the scientific sun, a hot gaseous star 330,000 times the size of Earth, pulsing away at a distance of 93 million miles. But part of us joins the children in a startle of recognition. Gods and goddesses, talking animals, tricky solutions, and living suns mirror truths dozing deep inside us. The seasonal solstice is a powerful metaphor for the psychological and cultural solstices of our lives. Waiting on the threshold in the dark, alone and together, we dare to hope for spring. We know too much and not nearly enough. We have to believe it all matters, and we have an agonizing hunch it might not. These are the winter tales that sew from all the scraps a quilt of hope, wisdom, and humor. And that was the introduction to Sun Stories, Tales from Around the World to Illuminate the Days and Nights of Our Lives. So next time it's going to be Mother Sun and Her People, which is a sun story from the Cherokee Nation in North America. But until then, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.